So thank you very much for organizing this, and it's great that you have this collaboration. And thank you very much for having me to open this first session. I'll try to do as well as I can in doing that. And thank you also for giving me the opportunity to go back into Suárez political philosophy. It's mostly work on natural philosophy and metaphysics right now, but I'm always happy to go back to his political philosophy. And actually, the topic of this talk has become somewhat of a hot topic through the events of the last weeks. Because the conundrum that I'm talking about regards the status of a king. I'll just use the word king here for princeps in Latin, the foremost, the prince. It's sometimes translated as well. And the status of this king in relation then to the body politic, and all of these concepts I'll define more clearly what they mean in the thinking of Suárez later on. But basically, in his work De Legibus, or De Legibus ac Deo Legislatore from 1612, Francisco Suárez insists that the political power held by the king, then princeps, is not had by delegation, delegatio, from the body politic. It's not like a representative just of this body politic, the res publica, but it's rather held by transfer and alienatio, an alienation of said power to the king from the body politic, as he writes. Hence, it follows that, quote, the king cannot be deprived of this power since he has acquired a true ownership of it, end quote. So here, Suárez seems to stress that once the king has gotten this power, it's the king's power, so it cannot be divested from him. However, then in the work Defensio Fidei from 1613, the work written against the Anglican Church in James I, and it's the defense then of the Catholic faith against this. Suárez consents to the killing of a king who holds the throne lawfully in some cases. So even in the case of a king who holds the political power in the right way, in a lawful way, he consents to the killing of this king. So how do these views square? How can he hold these positions at the same time? And do they square, or is it two different works and that has changed its mindset? So in order to show how he thinks about this and how it could cohere, I'll start talking just a bit about Francisco Suárez. All of you might know about this perhaps, but for the possibility of someone not knowing, I'll just give some brief overview. Then I'll talk a bit about the foundations of political power, and implicit in all of these titles is, of course, according to Suárez. So then we'll see and look at the relation between the king on the one hand or the princeps then, and the political body on the other hand. Then go to look at his view on tyranny, and last the question of who can kill a tyrant. As I said, a topic that's become somewhat of a hot topic, unfortunately. So first of all, on Francisco Suárez. So he was born 1548 in Granada, Andalusia, I guess. Sorry. He entered the Jesuits in 1564 in Salamanca. At first, he was only admitted to become not a priest, but a brother. They thought he didn't have really the intellectual capacity to become a priest. And he actually entered in order to become a priest later. And they then recognized that he had these abilities, but obviously his first philosophical studies didn't go very well. So he had to take an exam 3 times in order to make it and so on. But he seems to have really stepped up his game, and something happened there. So quite early on, he became a teacher in philosophy, and from 1574 became a teacher in theology in Valladolid, Segovia, Alcalá, and in Rome. He was in Rome 1580 to 1585. From 1597, he taught theology in Coimbra, and he did this until his death then in 1617. As a lot of these philosophers and theologians, he wrote a lot. He has an opera omnia in 26 folio volumes. It's mostly in theology then. For example, 3 volumes of the opera omnia are devoted to the question of grace. We have this theological debates between the Dominicans and Jesuits, the auxilies, on the question of grace during this time. But he also managed to write the first complete metaphysical work in the Latin West that was not a commentary on Aristotle's metaphysics. This is then the Disputationes Metaphysicae that came out in 1597. But in the preface to that work, he writes that he writes this metaphysics in order to kind of clarify fundamental concepts that have a bearing on theology. So it's always, one has to remember, from very much an interest in theology that is working. Later in life, then, he also wrote some political tracts, and the most important then are the De Legibus ac Deo Legislatore from 1612, and also then the Defensio Fidei Catholicae et Apostolicae adversus Anglicanes secte errores in 1613. And this work, James I had it burned in London, and we'll see why later on. However, parts of his political philosophy can also be found in some other works. Let's see if I can. Okay, so that's basically a bit about Suárez. Let's then go over to his view on the foundations of political power. From whence does political power arise? Where does it come from? What's its basis? So according to Suárez, no human is him or herself by nature endowed with a political power over others, one should say. So no persons are by the nature of things dominant over other people, but all people are born free. So this actually, it ties into his basic anthropology, philosophical anthropology, and also his understanding of grace, with this stress on the free will, and also the free will as the basis of certain rights and so on. So we have a recurring theme that also enters into his political philosophy, the question of human freedom. Instead, then, political power belongs fundamentally to mankind as a whole, viewed collectively. So here's a quote, DL, that's De Legibus. Here's a quote, "The power in question resides by the sole force of natural law in the whole body of mankind, collectively regarded. The proof is as follows: this power does exist in man, and it does not exist in each individual, nor in any specific individual, as has also been shown. Therefore, it exists in mankind viewed collectively, in collectione. For a foregoing division into the two alternatives sufficiently covers the case." This is the common way for him to argue. He has different ways something can be. Let's say three ways it can be. He excludes 2 of them, so it has to be the third. So that's a common way of argumentation for him. So it is then with the people or mankind that political power fundamentally or basically resides, according to Suárez. So how then does it reside there? What's its form? Asked in another way, does it just reside there, that we have just person 1, person 2, and so on? James, Susan, just taken one after another, and it just collectively resides in these somehow? Or is something else needed in order for it to be realized, so to say? And the answer is that actually acts of volition, once again, stress on free will, acts of volition of those constituting the political body is needed in order for this political power to be realized. So here's another quote. Quote, "The multitude of mankind should then be viewed from another standpoint when treated in relation to political power. That is, with regard to the special volition or common consent by which they are gathered together into one political body through one bond of fellowship, and for the purpose of aiding one another in the attainment of a single political end. Thus viewed, they form a single mystical body, unum corpus mysticum, which, morally speaking, may be termed essentially a unity. Moraliter dici potest per se unum." It is then by a consent of those constituting the political body that it is brought forth or brought about. If one is interested in the relation to metaphysics, the state would then end up in Disputation 54, the very last disputation, not really being a real being, but rather than being a reason, ens rationis, what he calls umbra entis, or shadows of being. So it would hold that kind of status, like artifacts and so on. But thereby also the basic subject then of political power, the body politic, depends for its existence on the act of will of the people constituting it. So there is this discussion regarding whether this is social contract theory and so on, or proto-social contract theory. I won't enter into that here really, but one reflection is that I believe that a lot of discussion in Suárez, as well as other, really political philosophy in the long scholastic tradition, is very much influenced by Cicero and Ciceronian political philosophy. So there you find this common consent or some kind of agreement as the basis for how the state, how the res publica comes up. So that's a better context rather than looking from the future from Suárez's point of view, so to say. So whether one wants to call it a kind of proto-social contract theory or not, it's a matter of words, as Suárez also usually says. However, I think that actually compared to Cicero has almost more of a clear historical understanding of this, that once sometime long ago something happened, people constituted this, whereas in Suárez it has almost the character of being in a kind of in the order of things, that at the basis of it we have this consent. It's not really, doesn't seem that it thinks of it as necessarily something taking place sometime long ago, let's say. And here is also a cosmopolitan interlude. I think that when following his argumentation here, it's actually hard to see why there are political entities in the plural. He says that mankind has, and so on. So in a sense, it would be more reasonable or in line with this political philosophy that there is only one political entity for the whole mankind. And Suárez actually addresses this question. And he says that, he says that mankind does not necessarily constitute one body politic. So it's possible that there are many. Well, there are actually in the world. And he writes also that it would hardly be possible, nor would it be expedient to have just one world state, so to say. He also refers to Aristotle on this question. However, there's no real principal argument against this idea of a kind of cosmopolitanism. which again isn't that extraordinary or surprising given a kind of Ciceronian background to this thinking. Okay, so that's just some thoughts on its basic political philosophy. So how does a king or prince or princeps enter into this picture? So it's by an act of consent that people gather into and constitute one political body. That then remind that this political body constitutes a per se unity, morally speaking, in which political power resides. So where do we go from there? Well, the people then, this body politic, can actually legitimately choose whichever form of government that they see fit. He writes that, quote, although this power to make laws is, so to speak, a natural attribute of a perfect human community, viewed as such, nevertheless, it does not reside immutably therein, but may be taken from that community by its own consent or through some other just means and transferred to another seat of authority, end quote. And also, quote, although the power in question is in an absolute sense an effect of the natural law, its specific application as a certain form of power and government is dependent upon human choice, ex arbitrio humano, end quote. So what forms of government do we have according to Suárez? Well, once again, a classical tradition, he comes with three forms of government: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. Of these, then, he thinks that monarchy is the best one. You have one body, you should have one ruler, and so on. But the others are also legitimate, and basically some mixture is generally to be preferred, as in Cicero. So we have a quote here, quote, it is as a rule expedient to add some element of common government, which is executed by a number of persons, this common element being greater or smaller according to the varying customs and judgment of men. Accordingly, this whole matter turns upon human counsel and human choice, end quote. So it's different in different contexts. And I would just add here that the Swedish constitutional monarchy, I think, Suárez would agree with. Doesn't have to be an argument for or against. I'm just saying that. So how is the power bestowed on the king? Once again, Suárez stresses the component of consent. Quote, civil power, whenever it resides in the right and ordinary course of law, in the person of one individual or princeps, it has flowed from the people as a community, either directly or indirectly, nor could it otherwise be justly held. In order that it may justly come to reside in a given individual, as in a sovereign prince, it must necessarily be bestowed upon him by the consent of the community, ex consenso communitatis, end quote. This bestowal, though, and this is important, comes with certain conditions. In a hereditary monarchy, these conditions come indirectly to the heir. So one can say, well, if they're heirs to the throne, it doesn't attach, but well, it indirectly then attaches to those following the first princeps, so to say. So we have, quote, therefore the first possessor must have derived the supreme power directly from the commonwealth, while his successors must derive it from the same source indirectly, yet fundamentally. Moreover, since any possession passes into the hands of a successor with its accompanying obligations, the conditions attaching to the kingly power when it was transmitted by the commonwealth to the first king passed to his successors, so that they possess that power together with the original obligations, end quote. So we have these strings. On the other hand, as we saw in the beginning, it's also important to stress this true supremacy. So once this power has been handed over, it's been really handed over. It's held by the princeps, it's held by the king. So, quote, for once the power has been transferred to the king, he is through that power rendered superior even to the kingdom which bestowed it, since by this bestowal the kingdom has subjected itself and has deprived itself of its former liberty, just as is in due proportion clearly true in the case of the slave, which we have mentioned by way of illustration. Moreover, in accordance with the same reasoning, the king cannot be deprived of this power, since he has acquired a true ownership of it. Unless, and here it comes, I think this is the significant part and how we can get this together. Unless perchance he lapses into tyranny, on which ground the kingdom may wage a just war against him, a point which we consider elsewhere, end quote. So as I said, last clause here on tyranny is the way forward, I think, to that makes his position coherent. Just before I continue with tyranny, just pointing out point of reference in relation to ecclesiology and this question of monarchy. As I said, one body, it's befitting to have one monarch, one person ruling. This is all the more so in the case of the church, then, that is the perfect mystical body, the perfect body by this people coming together. And we have this interesting book by Kantorowicz from 1957, The King's Two Bodies, that follows this let's say political theology throughout the medieval times. But also then in the case of the church, it's proper that there is some mixture in the government. So we have councils, we have the curia and so on. But it's even more fitting than in the case of a state that it's not a perfect mystical body. Okay, so back to the political philosophy, tyranny. There is something then that can be called an illegitimate rule of a monarch. Although then the superiority of a legitimate monarch is also stressed. This is not necessarily the case. Contrast this view with Hobbes, for example, a bit later in Leviathan. So, quote, there be other names of government in the histories and books of policy, as tyranny and oligarchy, but they are not the names of other forms of government, but of the same forms misliked. For they that are discontented under monarchy call it tyranny, and they that are displeased with aristocracy call it oligarchy. So also they which find themselves grieved under a democracy call it anarchy, end quote. So this is in contrast then. Suarez truly believes that there is can be an illegitimate rule of a monarch. And basically we have two forms of tyranny. It could either be one, those who have seized the throne unjustly, and this is the clearest case. As he writes, quote, these tyrants are not kings and rulers in reality, but simply usurp the position of king and imitate the role of royalty, end quote. However, the second case is more interesting, I think. It's true rulers, but who misuse power. So, quote, he either alpha turns all things to his private advantage, neglecting the common advantage, or else beta unjustly oppresses his subjects by plunder, slaughter, corruption, or the unjust perpetration of other similar deeds with public effect on numerous occasions, end quote. So we have here then an example of someone who legitimately holds the power, but by the actions becomes a tyrant. It is then, to go back to this proto-social contract theory or the consent, by the breaking of the obligations that this legitimate rule has been turned into tyranny. So the last question, and then I'll stop. Who can kill a tyrant? For a tyrant of the first kind, a usurper of the throne, anyone can kill him, according to Suarez. More specifically, though, it is the public power vested in one individual that is needed. For the rightful king turned tyrant, though, it's a bit more complex. This must be, then, in a sense, commanded by the state, or in the case of a Christian king turned tyrant, for example, through heresy. That's why his book was burned by James I. It can be ordered by the Pope. He develops the thinking about the reflection regarding the killing of a tyrant. Of course, he's very reluctant. I mean, if it's just on account of certain unjust acts that you can deem the king a tyrant, it would just be revolts everywhere and so on. So he's very, I mean, I'm just summarizing some of his thinking. He's very, very careful in it, and he's not encouraging people to take things in their own hands and so on. But he's developing these thoughts in the work De Triplici Virtute. And he relates it, interestingly, I think, to the case of just war. So he writes, for example, quote, "I hold that a war of a state against the prince, even if it be aggressive, is not intrinsically evil, but that the conditions necessary for a war that is in other respects just must nevertheless be present in order that this sort of war may be righteous," end quote. So in the case of consistent tyrannical acts or unjust acts, also lawful king has become subordinate to the state again, according to Suárez. Quote, "Under the circumstances described, the state as a whole is superior to the king, for the state, when it granted him this power, is held to have granted it upon these conditions, that he should govern in accord with the public well-being and not tyrannically, and that if he did not govern thus, he might be deposed from that position of power," end quote. So, brief summary. According to Suárez, the foundation for political power is the body politic, formed by the joint will and consent of the people constituting it. This power can and should be actually handed over to a king, a princeps, although, remember, a mixed government is the best. The bestowal of this power is made under certain conditions, though. If these conditions are broken, the state, that is the people as a whole, may wage war on the king. In this way, Suárez can combine a strong emphasis on the political power sovereignly held by a monarch with an understanding that the people of the state under the king may justly rise in revolt against him. Thank you for your kind patience and attention.